Hey, good evening, everyone, and thank you for our current edition of the South Carolina Arts Network. For this evening's presentation, our topic will be leadership transition, planning, and implementation. This workshop will be about the changing in leadership and the importance of the points of life for any company, so as it affects stability, culture, and performance. We will be presented with our gracious host today, Ginny Waller. She is a former executive director of the largest freestanding sexual assault service agency in South Carolina. She is also a skilled facilitator, virtual and in person, a licensed lawyer in South Carolina with more than 17 years of experience in nonprofit leadership, strategic planning, operational effectiveness, and specialization in change management and relationship building. To also give you more information about her, she has received numerous accolades of excellence in the profession, of the Award for Nonprofit Leadership in 2013, the South Carolina Association of Nonprofit Organizations. She has received the President's Award in 2012 and the Young Laureate of the Year Award in 2008 from the South Carolina Bar, and also the 2015 recipient of the Fundraising Professional of the Year Award through the Association of Fundraising Professionals for the Midlands chapter. It is my pleasure to welcome Ginny Waller to speak with us this evening. And Ginny, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So I need to change the dates on that because that immediately dated me. It just shows my vast years of experience though in the nonprofit work. So I appreciate that nice introduction, and I look forward to presenting today. So we're going to get started. I think we have an introductory slide that we may skim through just for the sake of time. But I'd love to first give us grounding about what our learning objectives are so that we all walk away with at least now getting set clear expectations of what we anticipate to learn. And our learning objectives for this particular session are one, that you'll be able to analyze the effects of various types of leadership transitions. So what are the impact? What's the trickle down to an organization from any leadership transition, whether it's planned or unplanned? The second is that you'll be able to then develop your own comprehensive leadership transition strategy and have some very specific ways of going about implementing that. And then lastly is you'll be able to evaluate your current leadership development programs and propose improvements, because one of the key ways to build succession in your organization is by developing emerging leaders within your organization. This is also an opportunity to address the diversity, equity, inclusion piece, and giving opportunity to individuals who may not otherwise have had a voice at the leadership stage. So we will talk about that with our learning objectives. So I do have a poll, and Larshall is going to launch it for us. It's, do you have a succession plan? And this is fairly simple. I'm not sure how we're going to do that.
Let me see. I thought that I could click it from my end. It's not working.
It may not. I don't see it. I don't see it on my end. So in the chat, if you want, you can add in. I want you to ask yourself, do I have a succession plan? So this is a plan. This is what do I have in place for succession of my leadership on my board, succession of leadership within my organization? If you do, you need to write yes, that it's written down, it's formal, you are fancy. Or is it, yes, it's just a verbal, everybody kind of understands, or maybe it's just in your head that you know what you want to the succession of your role to look like. And then, of course, no is an option. One of the statistics I think is really important to note here is that according to Board Source, only 29% of nonprofits reported that they had a written succession plan. So it's not unusual. And I think it's not a priority for a lot of organizations because the what ifs can be ignored. We've got too many fires going on right now. Talking about a fire that hasn't even started yet much more difficult. So there's no judgment here in your responses, but sure enough, in the chat, if you'll put that, what your succession plan is, just in your maybe have some just in your heads. And that is actually very normal. Most leaders are taking this with them, but I would challenge most nonprofit leaders to remember that if you are hit by the Mac bus, in law school, we called it the Mac bus theory. If you're hit by the Mac bus, all of that beautiful succession planning you have in your head goes out the window and is long gone. So we're going to talk about formalizing that today. So it's important first to start out with understanding your leadership transitions and really understanding the different components of that, starting with a definition. So the definition of leadership transition is when a nonprofit, essentially leadership, passes the torch to another person. We all understand that. And we know that transitions can be both planned and unplanned. So unexpected. But no matter what is happening, whether it's planned or unexpected, that requires a strategic communication plan to keep their employees and stakeholders informed. I am an interim executive director. I come into organizations when they're going through transition. Oftentimes I am not brought in. In fact, in none of my engagements have I been brought in when it was expected. So for all of you who are in the great majority, the 70% that don't actually have their strategic plan or their succession plans developed, I would tell you that it is much easier to come into an organization that has written it down than it is to come into an organization that has sudden, unexpected transition. All right, so here are some strategies for kind of today's framework of what we're going to do. Successful leadership transition really needs to include these 4 key components. 1, to establish interim leadership. So that could be a board member, an interim executive, consultant, or even a staff member to serve as acting director. I may be a little bit partial, but I've seen it in a lot of different ways. Unless it's a board member with experience leading a nonprofit, more than likely it needs to be an outside consultant. Oftentimes acting directors, individuals who are tasked with doing their job, plus now the acting director job, that can become too much and ends up causing more problems than it actually fixes. The second is involving the team. So getting the team engaged by discussing essentially why a new leader is needed, what is needed about them, what qualities, characteristics, skills, and really understanding that and what you need before it happens. So involving the team is really important. In transition management, so involving the outgoing leader, ideally, except when like an outgoing leader leaves at 5 p.m. on Friday and leaves their keys and doesn't come back, which is more of the occasions of when I'm brought in. And the incoming leader, if you can, the board, the staff, and the stakeholders in the transition process. And that's when you're really going to look at things like operational issues, financial, legal, or ethical. Anything that's been triggered by this transition needs to be looked at and really addressed. What usually happens is we're doing a lot of band-aiding. We'll say, oh, you know what? I don't think we submitted that budget that was due to that body by this date. Instead of sitting down and saying, what are all of our obligations that need to be fulfilled in the next 3 to 5 months? That would be a much more strategic transition management. And then, of course, developing a communication plan, something that's really well structured and timed to address the actual changes that are coming, what the process is going to look like. So most people are totally comfortable with getting the response of, we don't know, but we're working on it, as long as you're communicating with them. So having very clear communication plan and making sure that that your community and your stakeholders know that something is happening, and you can develop this beforehand, because the what's in it is more of, we're on the case. You know, it's a Paw Patrol sort of situation. We've got this, we're on the case. So here's the reality though. The National Council of Nonprofits shows that in a normal year, 10% of leaders left their position. So pre-pandemic, 10% transition. Not bad. That's not bad at all. That would be normal turnover. The problem with that is that of that 10%, 70% of those were not planned. So the great majority of these people leaving are not leaving, and that's still not, are not leaving on a planned way. So that's not, but that's still not all bad by itself, because it's such a small percentage. But then post-pandemic, The Chronicle of Philanthropy reports that 75% of the nonprofit leaders in the US are planning to leave their positions in the next 5 to 10 years. So if we have this really large percentage of people that are leaving unplanned, we had 10% that were all that already was happening, and now we know that another 75% are leaving on a planned, allegedly planned level in the next 5 to 10 years. They're planning to get out. We've got a big problem in transitions, and it's something an organization should be paying attention to. And I say all that to say I didn't do a great job of this as an executive director myself. It was something I thought of in like the last 2 years, but it needs to be something you're thinking about even if you're in year 1 of your organization. Another shocking statistic is that as many as 46% of leadership transitions, so this is after the new person has been onboarded, 46% of them are considered failures or disappointments 2 years after they come on board. So if we're not doing a great job of managing that transition, we are undoubtedly going to fail, because even with planned transitions, they can fail very easily. So we've got, I can't reiterate enough how important it is to think about planning.
Jenny, I have a question for you before you
Yes,
move
please.
on. For the ones for the 40% that are considered a failed transition, is that because they didn't get the proper strategy in place for the transition, or is that failure because that person leaves within that transition period?
Yeah, so the studies that have been done by McKinley Scott have been, most of it's been they haven't been properly onboarded and introduced to the organization, one. And then the second is that the organization was not properly prepped for new leaders. So there's really a twofold situation that kind of seems to be happening when we're bringing in someone new. We basically say, here's all the crap, good luck to you, right? And then we're not giving them clarity around what our expectations about them are. And as you know, most nonprofit directors are expected to solve all the world's problems.
Right.
So they have this really high expectations, no clarity around what's really success looks like, and then no onboarding or pause to get done. And then in addition to that, you have toxicity within the organization, staff members who are resistant. They haven't been framed properly to handle a new person.
Okay, thank you.
So here's the impact of it. And this is big. I don't know how many transitions you guys have been around with nonprofits, but even if it is the best planned transition in the world, there is such an impact, right? So whether it's unexpected, whether it is anticipated of a long tenured leader leaving, it has to have a plan in place because one, there's a cultural shift. Anytime you bring someone else new in, it's like bringing in a new president, right? Whole new regime, new platforms, new people. It changes everything. And it's going to change the culture because what they do is going to be different from the previous leader, even if they're similar in their leadership. This can lead to tensions. It can disrupt workflows. People think that they may not have to perform at the same level because nobody's on top of them and holding them accountable. They have more and they're also suffering some amount of trauma if it's an actually unexpected transition. Like, for instance, the organization I gave as an example that had someone leave at 5 p.m. on a Friday. You can imagine the staff had a lot of, for lack of a better word, trauma as a direct result from feeling abandoned and not having leadership at the helm and how quickly it all happened. You also can have a talent drain. So key employees may leave, right? We're not sticking around for all this uncertainty, or we may not like the new person once the new person's here. So that can cause a talent drain. Loss of momentum. So you're working on things, projects and initiatives, and suddenly you're really hindered from getting that achieved, or you're slowed down because you don't have the person who was driving those projects. A decline in morale. This is number one for me, especially with mismanaged transitions. This can really decrease employee morale and engagement. And of course, that also affects productivity and workplace harmony, gossiping, toxicity. Here we go. It's almost like it just feeds into itself. Unclear communication is another impact. of leadership transitions, planned or not, where inadequate or unclear communication potentially can lead to misunderstandings and rumors, and again, employee morale is affected. And then the least of it is the cost. So if a transition is successful, you're actually going to have expenses no matter what. So even if you did all of this, you planned it beautifully, and you did this transition, you're still going to have some direct expenses like advertising for the position, searching, maybe relocation, referral awards, overhead of HR people getting involved, possibly other consultants to help during the interim. If it's a failed transition, you can estimate to spend 10 or more times the executive director's compensation trying to fix everything that was done wrong during the management of that transition. One of the McKinley Scott sources that I saw, or stats that I saw, said that they estimated that for an executive director role, around 213% of the annual salary will end up being spent for a failed transition. That's serious money for a nonprofit that has a fiduciary duty to the community, to the public, to use its funds wisely. So it almost becomes a legal and fiduciary duty for you to make sure you have a plan in place for a proper transition. So let's go over some of the best practices for effective leadership in the transition. First, we're going to start out with preparation and planning. So there's some preparation and planning is looking at the key strategies for maintaining continuity during the transition. Some of those include identifying your key positions, and you can do this on the front end. Like right now, today, you can sit down and say, what are my key positions within my organization? And you're going to look at what are the skills and experience required for each of those positions. So if you're a CEO, if you have a CEO and you have a CFO, you may look at both of those. It may just be your organization has you're an executive director, not just, because the executive directors are rock stars, but you want to sit down and you want to say, here's the role. What are all the things this person does? Now, for an organization that has a founder, or an organization that's had someone there for 10 years, more than likely that individual is doing so many things they're not even aware of. And it's become almost a where you would have to hire 3 people to do the job of that one executive director. So we need this, right? That's the first step. Second is we're going to look internally. What do we have internally with our current employees? What kind of strengths do they have that we could potentially lean on them for a leadership role? So when I was working at sexual trauma services for the years that I was there, I, in the last 2 years or so, started realizing I need to think about what I woke up and realized these stats and said I should do something about this. And I identified someone on my team that I felt like could potentially down the road hold this leadership role based off of the strengths that she exhibited. And then I made sure I nurtured the sin out of that. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit. You're going to want to develop a formal plan. So that's the third step in your preparation. You're going to sit down and you're going to say, essentially, this is how we're going to identify someone. This is how we're going to prepare them and onboard them. The more you have written down about your job, what you think the next person needs, how you see them onboarding, the more helpful it's going to be to an executive search committee or another body to figure out how to do this transition. Investing in professional development. So whether you identify someone on the team or not, part of your job, and this I can preach all day about, is to help develop future leaders, whether it's at your organization or not, to make the people who work for you better than they were before they came to work for you in their job and skill set. So providing training and development opportunities to help them develop those skills and competencies that they need for future roles. So for instance, the individual that I identified for following up in my role, not that I hired her or anything, and not that I told her this, but I started sending her to a lot of the leadership classes that are held across the state, and the community foundations that have leadership courses. I sent her to a lot of management training. I sent her to I think she ended up doing a leadership in a leadership Columbia or a leadership South Carolina, and several of those. An opportunity to not only develop internally as a person, but develop externally in the community, those relationships, so that she could be recognized as a voice for the organization if the board so chose to bring her in. Then planning for emergencies. So having an emergency succession plan in place. Well, what does that mean? I mean, what would the person tomorrow need? If you sat down and thought about this, what would a person need tomorrow if they had to come into this office and get in? Well, they can't get in without a key. How do they get into your computer? How do we get them into our systems? How do they know who we work with? Thinking about all of those things are important, and write it down. Planning for that emergency and the unexpected, believe me, board chairs will thank you. And then incorporating diversity and inclusion. So really looking at how do we give opportunity to someone within the organization internally who otherwise may not have that opportunity? How do we develop individuals from diverse communities that may be able to help this organization in a different direction from what you have even put it in? And how do I help develop them to do that? This is a real opportunity to bring a different voice to the table than we've had previously. And I was just talking to the Interim Executive Network up here in DC today about the fact that we have such an imperative as interim directors to help influence the efforts of diversity and inclusion. And you can do that. You can influence that in your role. And then using HR analytics. So this is where we're going to look at things like employee performance and their skill sets, their growth potential, and that can help also inform plans. So let's say, for instance, you decide, I see someone inside that organization, potential executive director, but that's going to leave a seat open for someone else on the leadership team, right? Her seat will now be open. Well, then you're going to need to make sure that you're thinking about that next person that's going to have to be pulled up to fill in the role that is vacated by your new ED. So it's not just about your ED, it's all the other things. And making sure that you're looking at your, I say things like use our HR analytics. I mean, you look at your stats, look at what they're doing, look at your resumes, review it with your team. That it's as simple as that. All right, so during an effective leadership transition, it's really important to keep clarity around the difference between board and staff. So you've got your preparation, you've written all this stuff, I know that if I walk in tomorrow into your office, I'm going to have a manual that's going to say, this is how you do my job. Well done. Now we need the board and the staff to know the difference in what they're supposed to do. And the board is going to be the hardest. So you're responsible. Here we go again. You're responsible for making sure they understand the level of responsibility that they have during a transition. So the board is responsible for planning, creating and communicating a plan for the transition. So you're creating this document, you're creating this material, so you're going to give this to them. You can say, this is my Mac bus, my Mac bus plan. This is not, I'm not going anywhere. I want you to have this in case anything ever happens to me. And that should include a timeline for any sort of transition. So if you can say, I think we could have, my plan is that we're going to have an interim director come in for 3 months. We'll do the search concurrently, and then we will have someone hired at 5 months and do onboarding. All that's written down. Here's the thing, even if they don't follow it, like by the book, it's giving them a roadmap. And for people who are bankers and lawyers and, working in different departments, program managers, they don't know this stuff. And it's your job to make sure that they have the tools they need if something does happen, or when it does, not if, when. Identifying the talent and helping previous staff leave on good terms. So you're going to be handing them this kind of plan. You're going to give them your ideas. By the way, they have the final say, right? As the board of directors. So you can say all day long, I believe Joan is the best person to follow me. That does not mean that Joan gets to do it. The board decides, but you can put that into your recommendations for your plan. But identifying that new talent and staying on that, helping the previous staff leave, so honoring the contributions of that previous executive director, even the one who left at 5 p.m. on a Friday, honoring that and making sure publicly that that's honored. Establishing policies that apply to the transition. So there are going to be policies that will come into play. One off the top of my head, compensation policy. Well, I can guarantee you're not making as much money right now as the new executive director will make because you haven't been asking for enough. And that's a whole nother seminar we'll have to do. But the new one coming in is going to get paid more because they are going to set that amount based off of a compensation analysis from looking at all executive directors in the state and incomparable sized organizations. And it's going to be more and more than likely than they're paying you. So making sure that you're looking at your different policies and how that could impact hiring policies, if you have onboarding policies, if your employee handbook's not up to date, those are the sorts of things that directly affect the ability to hire because it slows down if you have to get all of that in place before you can bring someone in. You're not going to hire somebody to come in and create your employee handbook. That's a terrible way to onboard someone. So the next part is onboarding. The board's responsible for that. Oftentimes they outsource that to people like me, but they are responsible for making sure the individual gets everything they need and that they're supporting all the new team members, whether or not somebody's moved to a new position, however that needs to look. So being very present in the onboarding process. For example, when I come in with an organization and I do onboarding, I create a 3, 6, 9-month performance plan. I give them a 30, 60, 90-day onboarding schedule. I've already made meetings for them and scheduled those out so they know who they're meeting with, when they're meeting with them. They have checklists of all their stakeholders, and they have a folder of all the documents that they need to onboard. I don't know of many executive directors who are getting that when they onboard. If you want them to be successful, we want to do it that way. Boards are responsible for that. Communicating those changes clearly and transparently. So one of the things I see oftentimes is people when they're in crisis, they go down like this, they cover their head, they don't want people to see what they're doing. Transparency really reduces. This is the time to overshare. As I mentioned earlier, we've got this. We're going to handle. We don't have the answers, but we've got this. And you already have a plan in place of how you've got this. So you can say that even if you don't know what the end result's going to be. And then sometimes, like I said, establishing interim leadership will be the board's responsibility. Interestingly, look what's less. The board is primary holder of all of this. This is why they fail, right? Because volunteers are not going to put into this what they need to. It's important you give them what they need. The staff are responsible really for just a few things, and that is to make sure that if they're growing in their roles and are moving up in leadership, that they're all about training, becoming better, getting involved, that they make sure there's a knowledge transfer, whether it's the person leaving or the person moving up, that they are very engaged in the onboarding process and they're bought into it. And then and from my opinion, the most important role of the staff is to keep positivity, uphold the culture, not to start gossiping, to just really build up the transition and how positive it's going to be. The only way they're going to do that, right, is because the board's helping make them know that it's going to be okay.
Jenny, we have
So,
another question before you
yeah,
move forward.
thank
So the
you.
question is, if you are an all-volunteer organization and there is no executive director, it's a working board, what is the gray line or how do you work within that parameter from what you described?
Yeah, so it's not going to be much different. It's going to have to end up being a volunteer, usually your chair on the board of directors, who's going to be responsible for creating that that manual essentially, and they're going to be responsible for ensuring that everything's in place. It doesn't change a lot, except you and I both know, thank you for the question, that volunteers don't keep things even remotely in the same place. So that's going to be a call for them to make sure that everything is in one location. And then identifying individuals for the board of directors and for board leadership is it's almost like a different training in of itself, because recruitment of new board members has to be like you've got people in the pipeline at all times. If you want to have true succession for a board of directors, the pipeline movement is mandatory. Otherwise, you're sitting around and you're saying, hey, who wants to be chair next? Not me, not me. That's not how a board should be running. So I actually do an entire training, since you asked that, I do an entire training on building a recruitment plan for boards because they just don't have them. But you can be thinking of how you can make sure you're properly giving the tools that and resources that are necessary to your next board chair and having them trained along the way as you're going so that they're getting that institutional knowledge and they're prepared to be the board chair once it's their time in the role. Okay. So here are some communication strategies. I'm not going to spend much time on this one. This is you want to think about ways that you're communicating both internally and externally. It's a lot of work, right? Like the board, I don't know how many, like if anybody wants to raise their hand on how many organizations you've seen actually do this, I would be impressed if anybody knows. No, I didn't think so. No hands. So really, this would be ideal, right? So we're going to host leader coffees with our staff internally, making sure that our key employees are working together on this plan. We're going to do that with our board as well. And we're going to look at potentially doing some site visits out to our different locations if we have more than one location. Small group meetings where we're bringing groups of stakeholders together. Maybe it's donors. I mean, what a great way to cultivate our donors. Bring them together, talk to them about this transition. Yeah, like welcome to the meeting. Here's a donut and some coffee. And yeah, we've had some pretty crazy stuff happen recently. And we want to just give you this meeting to answer your questions and hopefully build confidence in what the process that we're following. Obviously, one-on-one calls with key employees should be made immediately. Town hall meetings could be had if you answer to a larger community for organizations in the arts. Obviously, you have a very public face, and so having town halls within your facilities where you do an ask me anything sort of setup is really great. Have your board there to help answer those questions, not your staff, your board. And then, of course, doing press releases. So I usually recommend you should have one ready to go that basically says, it leaves the beginning blank, but basically says, this has happened, whatever this is, the person's left, the person is leaving. And then it says, and here is our plan. We already have it, right? Here's our plan. Stay tuned for more details as we get them to you. We're so excited about this next chapter in our life. So external stakeholders are equally important to the process. All right, so I have a case study to share with you. I looked for one specifically the arts. I haven't done an arts interim engagement myself, so I didn't have one specifically. So this one is a little bit of a stretch, but you're going to hear all the same things. So in this case, the executive director of this organization knew that he was going to be transitioning out eventually. He was older, as like many are happening and happened since the pandemic, like kind of questioning values and what your work should look like, work-life balance and all of that. And he decided, I'm not leaving now, but I'm going to leave in 3 years. And everything looked pretty good. But the executive committee and the board itself felt like maybe this was an opportunity to look at going a different direction with a different type of leader. Now, not now, but looking down the road. Well, there are a lot of things that needed to happen because of that. So they are looking at people within the organization that potentially can fill a different role from what the current executive director is. So someone maybe who is a fundraiser and the current executive director was not, and could help them with getting less dependency on government money. Someone who wanted to go a different direction, maybe with programs, and a bit different from the current executive director. And so some of that tensions grew, right? It was definite that the board was kind of looking at someone else to groom internally, and the executive director was looking at someone else. The board chair was a business guy. He was a fix-it guy. He came from the banking world. And on the other hand, you had the treasurer internally who wanted the organization as it had been about 15 years before, when it was a totally different mission sort of focus. And then the governance chair was really just impatient with the current administration and wanted to see a change. So there was a lot happening, right? A lot of different problems. But what did they not do? The one thing they did not do in this case, and nobody overreacted. Nobody decided to immediately terminate the executive. Nobody, I think that's a fear of many executive directors. What they chose to do was take back and look at all their options before deciding. So that's a good, healthy board. You can write that in your plan. Take the time to evaluate where we are and where we're going. So then the board was really just divided about what to do next. So they looked at anyone in the management roles that could potentially do the job. They also looked at the jobs themselves, and they had the executive director doing a lot of this, but at their instruction. So he reviewed all the management positions, including their job descriptions and their key functions. He looked at who could be filling his role in an emergency situation. He looked at whether or not they had the right finances now or would need later. So it was almost like a looking at things strategically from that honestly we do every day in our heads, but doing it in a much more methodical fashion. And talking to the board member about this and what the succession potentially could look like. And then the other thing you need to be thinking about, especially your board needs to be thinking about, is strategic planning and where you'll be potentially in your strategic planning process. Because if you're at the beginning, they are going to be handed a manual of how they're going to be, how they're going to perform. And if they're at the end, they'll be going into doing one for the organization. And that affects the type of individual you bring in. So they were also trying to project that. Where are we in the strategic planning process in 3 years? Where do we want to be as we onboard a new person? So the board actually used that 3 years notice to get everything for transition. That's amazing. And the executive director was doing so as well. And the executive director got to participate in the process. So he had ownership of that, even though he had some fear about losing authority. And so he didn't end up leaving sooner, which happens a lot, where they'll announce their resignation and then they're like, oh, heck with this, I'm out of here, because they don't want to deal with everything that's happening after they announce it when people panic. So the board was really able to focus on developing those individuals internally and making sure that their strategic direction was going to fit with whomever they brought on board. So this was great. They also ended up hiring a consultant in this case study. They hired a consultant to come in and learn about the management team and the board. This was before the executive director left. And that was able to help them give a real clarity around where they wanted to hit it in the timeline. So that was how they had those conversations. The fact that they were having them at all, right? Like, just have them, even if you don't hire somebody to do it. They did have a succession committee, so someone who was responsible for actually managing the transition. So you could have someone on your board lead that up, that's having these conversations with you, that is making sure that the individuals that are in line for succession are properly trained, and those who are going to follow them. So oftentimes succession planning is avoided entirely because it's uncomfortable, and sometimes it's done as like a check the box, we've got a succession plan, right? Like it says, we're going to put somebody in place. Check it, I got it, I have a succession plan. And that's really where these guys were different, because I say these guys, I'm all sorts of people, but this organization was different. They basically overcame that so that they could actually focus on ensuring that the leaders were prepared in the organization, that there was trust and communication between the board and the managers and the staff and the stakeholders externally all the way through. So for this organization, and I won't give you their name just because there's so many of the details internally, but this transition happened 10 years ago, and then the executive director who replaced that long-term executive director is still there. So he defied the statistics and did so because they invested so much in this. And there are a lot of more things I'm happy to share, where they did team retreats and a lot of one-on-one trainings, really amazing management of the transition. Are there any questions about that?
Yes, we have another question in the chat, and they want to know, you mentioned stakeholders. What is the part of the process where you include maybe a survey with stakeholders and to implement that within the strategic or the succession plan?
Yeah, okay, that's great. So if you're doing a strategic plan, and that's a separate kind of it's part of this, but you're going to want to survey your key stakeholders in your community. You always want to hear their voices. You're going to get your staff capacity and culture survey. You're going to do your board self-assessment. You're going to look at your documents, but you're also going to look at your key stakeholders and doing interviews as well as surveys of them. Whenever there is a transition, I always recommend identifying 10 to 12 key stakeholders who you want to hear from about what they want to see happen with this organization moving forward, whether you are in the middle of a strategic plan or not. And the reason is because they're going to tell you as much as you probably need to know about what your next executive director ideally will look like. And so having conversations with them, asking, like, what do you think the last executive director or the current one does really, really well? What do you think that you'd like to see them do differently? What do you think the organization's doing that you'd love to see them do more of? It's going to take a certain type of person, right? Some of us are cleaners. That's what I am. I come in, I do some cleaning, and then I leave. I grow an organization and then I leave. Some people come in and want stability from the get, and it may be that that is what your stakeholders want. They want a stable, strong force, but you're only going to find this out if you're surveying them. So you don't need to do a big, massive survey unless you have not planned this transition. And if you haven't planned it, you probably need to do all of it. You need to probably do a full survey of stakeholders. All right. So building and strengthening leadership capacity, we have really looking at 4 different categories. We want to identify leadership potential. I talked to you a little bit about this, observing behavior of how they interact with others, how they react to failure, how they make decisions, assessing their skills and evaluating if communication, problem solving, collaboration skills, the skills that you're going to want in a leader, no matter what you end up needing in specific qualifications are. Evaluating their work ethic, like this one's big, making sure that there's someone that is committed to the organization and overall if they're performing at a high level. And you can use all kinds of assessment tools to do this. This is fun for your staff, by the way. This is an opportunity for them to become better individuals as leaders within the organization, or just better employees. Personality tests, feedback surveys, 360-degree assessments, which are tough, but are very important to really evaluate their skills and their competencies and their motivations. Soliciting feedback from others. So there are people externally that know what your team looks like and which ones would make a good next leader. I mean, that's obviously everybody's got an opinion, but this is only going to inform the overall process. And then, of course, looking for indicators of leadership potential among individuals that you probably haven't thought of before. This is where, if there is an opportunity for leadership within from a diverse population, you could really look for things like initiative and creativity, adaptability, a willingness to learn, someone who's hungry. They may not be in a leadership role, but they could be. And this is a great time to look for that. Looking for ethical behavior. Ooh, this is the biggie, in my opinion. We need someone who's going to stand up, hold the moral high ground, and make sure the organization's always in compliance. And then, of course, someone who's performing at a very high level, no matter what the conditions are, whether they're getting handheld or not, independent work. So we can do a few things to make sure we're developing these people. A mentorship program, basically what I did with my predecessor, or would it be predecessor or successor, is I took her along with me. She went with me everywhere. After she went to all these meetings and these trainings, I basically mentored her into her role. She saw how I performed at meetings. She saw what I did. I'm sure she didn't adopt all of that, but she just had an opportunity to become kind of the second, which made it easier for her to move into the first. And I started that about 2 years before I left. Training workshops and ongoing education. So you can do a lot, but what you want to do is create an environment that nurtures future leaders. If you don't do this and all you do is complain about how busy you are and how stressed you are, nobody's going to want that job. So we don't want to set the organization up for that, or the board of directors up for that. So I have a little poll here. I want everyone to kind of stop, pause, and ask yourself how you're currently supporting your leadership and developing your leadership. And there are a few options, whether or not you have a formal mentoring program or leadership training, workshops, seminars, cross-departmental projects. I love that. Having someone who's from finance work on something that's program related is so good. Regularly performing performance assessments, external leadership courses, Or maybe your answer is we don't have any of this and we really need to think about it. Okay. I'm going to let everyone pause on that. And I'll be happy to share afterwards this list so that people can get an idea of some options they could do. All right. So implementing the best practices. This is our action plan. It's really 2 steps, action plan and then the follow through evaluation. But essentially, this is guiding your folks through developing a simple action plan. You can do this with your board of directors, and you can do this with your staff. But essentially, you're looking at what do we need? So we've already reviewed all our materials. We've done a job study. We've surveyed the board. We've surveyed our senior staff or all of our staff. We've looked at stakeholders and talked to them about what do we need for this organization. Now we're going to actually implement what the process needs to look like and identify the actual candidates that we're going to be grooming. Your board should know if you have someone in mind for leadership, who that is, how you're developing them, where do you see the problems, where do you, they should know all this. This is what we're talking. This is part of the thing, what they should be weighing in on. You're going to create a succession plan and then you're going to revise it annually, right? Because things change. I mean, Joan may decide this is not the organization for me or gets a great opportunity to be an ED before you leave. So we're constantly evaluating whether or not that should happen. So that should happen on an annual basis. And then we're also going to look at training and development for our current team. What programs do we need to offer? What workshops? What do we need to do for making sure that they're getting where they need to go? And then the last big part of the action plan, and these are the 4 categories I don't think you can do without. The next 2, I think you can, but that's the communication strategies, the big number 4. And that is basically maintaining that transparency we talked about, making sure that the board weighs in on how we're communicating everything, having it already drawn up. Who's going to do what? Who's going to do the press release? Who's going to send it? Who is going to make sure that internally the announcements made? Those are things that already should be written down. Your board can talk about it, but that's all part of your succession plan. And then, of course, piloting, implementation, you can run through it. You can do scenarios. That's a fun one with boards. Like, let's say tomorrow I get hit by a Mack truck. What happens? And the board starts talking it out. Well, I won't know where to go for this. Or the staff starts talking it out. We won't know who's going to do the report that's due at end of month. That's how you find out what's going to be missed. Obviously, you need to review and revise all the time because of organizational changes, as I mentioned. You want to be agile. You want to know that things are going to change. But if you've practiced this, the fear is taken away, and it really does help. It also helps with onboarding because you're onboarding, recruiting, and onboarding because you're going to attract higher quality candidates if you have your business together. And you are going to have success in onboarding those individuals if you are healthy versus being toxic because of a bad transition. And then there's, of course, ways you can track performance so that we can see how well the transition did. We can ask staff. I always say do a staff capacity and culture survey right when the transition happens, and then do one after a few months of the new executive director being on board. And that's going to give you an idea of the effectiveness of that transition and whether or not it was successful. So we can even set up a number of monitoring and evaluation tools. Retention rates are another thing. Obviously, a lot of things weigh into employee retention, but this is just one more thing that can inform us whether or not we had a successful transition. Using surveys, doing interviews, you can also do a lot of that. Do we have any questions? No, nothing.
No.
Okay. All right, so here I was going to do a little bit of breakout. I think we have a small group. So I want us to consider a scenario where your nonprofit CEO suddenly resigns. What steps would you take to ensure a smooth transition? And then we're going to do a little action plan based on the principles we've covered today. So we've got some key steps that need to happen. What steps would you take to ensure a smooth transition? They left. They suddenly resigned. They're gone. What's the first step? And I'm going to scoot us back here.
You have someone in the chat that wrote that they need to get the manual that was written for the succession plan.
Well, that absolutely, that is the number one, right? Because it's already written down. So great. That is the perfect answer. And I actually wanted to get us back to, went too far on my slides. Okay. So we have the manual. We know what's going to happen. But what about, oh, one more slide. What about if we haven't written this action plan and we've got to make a decision today? We don't have the manual that we wish we had done in advance. What is going to be our first step if we're looking at this transition? Obviously, the things like the lights and the computers and all that. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about like bigger picture. How do we make this transition effective? So our first step is going to be that assessment and needs analysis. So we want to understand where the organization is today. We want to know what the job looks like. We want to know what the senior staff think. We want to know where the staff stand. Is the board performing at a high level? Do we have the paperwork we need in place? We want to know all of that. We're going to move fast to get that done. And so the next step is going to be looking internally. Do we have leaders within the organization potentially that could move up into a position, into the next position, or do we need to do a full search? Now, this is debatable. A lot of nonprofits do not have a lot of money and they don't want to do a full search. And I understand that. So if you've been grooming someone properly, you may have someone to be able to move directly into position. I am a proponent of full executive searches because I think oftentimes there needs to be buy-in from others outside of the organization that that's the right candidate and not someone that just got it because they were groomed for the role. But say you don't have someone for that, then your next step is going to be identifying the ideal candidate, that profile that you want, and then posting that job. In the meantime, internally, you're going to have to identify where do we have gaps? Where do we need training and development for the team we currently have on staff? Then number 4 is your communications. We've got to communicate. Who do we need to talk to? We need to talk to our community, our external stakeholders, with the press. We have our internal people we have to talk to. Who do we need to be communicating with about what our strategy is in the next step? So those are your big ones. Like if we're doing the scenario. So he's resigned. We've got the big immediate reaction. Now, next steps. So the next steps are we put in an interim or we put in an acting director, whether that's the board chair or someone on staff. We make sure that that individual has some of their duties that they already had taken off of their plate. We start the search. Once we get we've done things like town halls and focus groups, and I don't even know, it would depend on your organization. In an arts organization, you could have all kinds of community-based buy-in. So this is a time for you to sell that ideal candidate profile and where the organization is going. I also like to add in, it would be really great here to add in some positive press. So doing some media that's unrelated to the transition so that they see like the work goes on. The work goes on no matter who's in charge. And so that also should be included in there. And then for the onboarding, making sure that the staff play a role in the search itself, not in decision making, but in participating in it beyond the ideal candidate profile. And whether that's interviewing at the end when there's a final candidate or candidates, but that they play some role, and then that you have very specific guidance to them for how they're going to implement this succession, this transition, and how they're going to onboard with a 30, 60, 90-day onboarding plan and a 3, 6, 9-month targeted goals. Here are some resources and tools for you. These are things that I think, it's like you're not going to do anything else, right? You're listening to me, you're like, I'm not going to do any scenario planning. I can barely get my board to meet. Okay, I hear all of that. These are some things that you can immediately do as an executive director that will help you. These are, for instance, like the blue avocado. That's actually a bit of how-to that you can insert. You can insert your answers. So it'll ask you answers to kind of tease out what your responses should be. For communicating, this is one that helps you remember all your different stakeholders. And then this board self-assessment is one of my favorites. It's with the New Hampshire nonprofits, and it's about, I think it's $89, and every single member of your board can take it and they'll give you this beautiful report. You can do it like this, so you have it in hand, no matter if the leadership, if it was planned or unplanned transition. And I wanted to leave a minute or two for Q&A if we have any additional questions, and I haven't checked the chat. Oh, and yeah.
It doesn't look like we have any additional questions, but there is a question. It's a question, but not a specific question. So their scenario is that they have worked with a nonprofit organization who in the past, it looks 6 years, has had three directors. And each time they've been in transition, the board chair has served as the interim until a new one has been hired. So they want to know what is the best way for them to move forward to make sure that this next transition won't be like the last few.
Wow. Wow. That is a lot of turmoil. That's very stressful. Well, and obviously not knowing the specifics of the situation, it sounds to me like they're not doing enough of organizational assessment early on, the early part, to understand what the organization needs in its next leadership. Maybe trying to fit a square peg in a round hole and looking for a candidate that looks a certain way for a job that is not suitable. So that's where I would scoot back. I would say taking it back and seeing if that's really what's happening here. And we need to like take a breather before we actually onboard or find the next candidate. And there also may be that and this is way just guessing, but if a board chair is doing the work and then a new executive director comes in, that board chair likely has a hard time letting go. And my guess is there's some overreach. There may be buy-in with the board chair, but no buy-in with the new executive director because there's some amount of overreach from the board into the staff operations. That's guessing, but I would say start with that org assessment and get a really good idea of what's going on there. I mean, if it is overreach, you'll learn that. If it's that you don't know where you're going, you need to do a strategic plan, you'll learn that. And that's where I would start, because if you don't know your foundations, you shouldn't be hiring someone and bringing them in. That's not fair to that person. And it's certainly not fair to your team that has seen this kind of turmoil for 6 years.
Yeah, that's the only one that we had in the chat.
So I have a little feedback survey, and I would love for people to give it, to fill it out if they have time. That helps me for improving trainings in the future. And that is me.
Well, Ginny, I would just want to say thank you for providing all the information that you did to our group today. It has been a pleasure. And anyone, if you're more interested in learning more about the services that Ginny offers, you can utilize her contact. And there's also some arts project support grant for professional development if you want to utilize that for her services. Those are available. So please let us know how we can assist you with that. And thank you so much, and y'all have a wonderful evening.